Good day, I'm Dr. T and welcome to my office. So today I'd like to talk about carbohydrates, specifically monosaccharides. So carbohydrates get their name from the fact that if you look at the empirical formula for the monosaccharides, it's going to be CH2O. It almost looks like wet carbon. And, well, it's not wet carbon. There's not water in there, but there is definitely oxygens and hydrogens. So if you look at a monosaccharide, they actually come in two forms, and they'll transition back and forth, a linear form and a ring-shaped form. I'll deal with the ring-shaped forms towards the end, although that's actually their normal form. So if you look at a carbohydrate, it's going to have, a nice linear chain of carbon, and most of those carbons are going to have a hydrogen and an alcohol group on them. Now, this has a couple of consequences. One, they're going to be incredibly hydrophilic. Very, very polar, great hydrogen bonding. So most carbohydrates are very hydrophilic. There are exceptions, but that ends up being weird ways of packing the alcohol, so they bond with themselves, and they don't do the hydrogen bonding with the water instead, just hydrogen bonding with themselves. Cellulose is kind of weird. But, back to the monosaccharides. Now, most of your carbons are going to be like that. There are two exceptions. The one at the tail is going to have two hydrogens and an OH group. Potentially one on both ends, but that depends on what the other end of the chain looks like, because there is a second carbon that is a carbonyl carbon. For a lot of carbohydrates, that's going to be on the end, and it's going to be an aldehyde. Those we call aldoses. However, not all carbohydrates are aldoses. That carbonyl carbon could be in a little bit. And in that case, it would be a ketone if it's not on the end carbon. And those, you guessed it, are called ketoses. The ose at the end is a suffix meaning carbohydrate or sugar. There's a couple of interesting suffixes that kind of get interchanged in their use. Okay, so that's actually a way of classifying monosaccharides. Are they ketoses or are they aldoses? Monosaccharides such as fructose is a ketose. Others like glucose, galactose, and ribose are aldoses. The next thing you have is, well, how many carbons are in this particular monosaccharide? There could be 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 is typically the most common, but 5 is definitely very prevalent, and there are things like 7-carbon carbohydrates. For these, their length is described by a Greek numeral prefix. So a triose would have 3 carbons. A pentose would have 5 carbons, such as ribose. Fructose, glucose, and galactose, those are all hexoses. They have 6 carbons. Now, typically speaking, we think of these guys as these long chains, but they almost always form rings. The way they form rings is that one of the alcohol groups, typically towards the tail, or the higher numbered carbons as you would count them, so away from the carbonyl carbon, is going to have its alcohol attack the carbonyl carbon. This does effectively kind of a nucleophilic substitution, although it's kind of a weird one. And so that alcohol then becomes a part of a hemiacetal. A hemiacetal is going to look like a single carbon that on one end has an ester, and that's where that alcohol that did the attacking turns into. And on the other end, an alcohol, and that alcohol is what was once the carbonyl carbon. Now, because you just attach the tail to the head, you form a ring. And so most of the time, carbohydrates in the monosaccharides are going to form a ring. Now, this hemiacetals are fairly ephemeral, so they can form a ring, they can break the ring apart, they can form the ring, they can break the ring apart. Depending on the orientation of the anomeric carbon, the one that's actually part of the carbonyl, the one that's forming the new OH group, depending on its orientation, we'll either describe those as alpha or beta. And I'll jump a little bit more of those once I start talking about how we connect these together, forming acetals, because at that point it'll become important. But it's temporary, so alpha, beta, alpha, and just flips back and forth. Monosaccharides are going to be fairly reactive. They do have potentially an aldehyde, and aldehydes are both reducing agents as well as good electrophiles. So they can do chemical reactions, which is why diabetes is a problem, because glucose is an aldose, and even if it was a ketose, it still would create problems. Thus, having too much glucose running around in your bloodstream, which is what blood sugar is, it's glucose, causes collateral damage. Small amounts, your body repairs it. More and more things get broken, the less you're able to get everything repaired, and eventually damage does ensue if high glucose levels are maintained for too long of a period of time, which of course is diabetes. Okay, so yeah, we've got our monosaccharides. Now, monosaccharides like glucose and galactose, those are distereoisomers, and there's going to be tons and tons and tons of distereoisomers because all of those carbons, at least most of them, are going to be chiral. All of those ones that have an alcohol, hydrogen, and stuck onto two other carbons. Good in chiral, we've got lots of chiral carbons, so lots and lots of distereoisomers, and those are all going to get their own names. For the most part, though, we're really going to focus on glucose and kind of the four that I have been mentioning. So I'll dive deeper into the uses of monosaccharides in later videos, but I will leave you with this. As you would probably guess, glucose is used heavily by animals as a short-term energy storage. So you consume your food, it's probably a polysaccharide, it's turned into glucose that floats around your bloodstream, and your tissues, you then use that to manufacture adenosine triphosphate, or I should say take ADP and use the energy to stick another phosphate on it, making ATP. So with that said, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in a later video.